At first, the war seemed ordinary. When humanity detected the first enemy incursions in frontier systems, nothing indicated that this conflict would be any different from the many others recorded throughout interstellar expansion. Fleets were mobilized, defense protocols activated, strategic intelligences initiated full-scale simulations. The enemy possessed advanced technology, but not superior to humanity's. At least, not at that first contact. The first battles were clear victories. Enemy ships were destroyed with surgical precision. Captured systems were retaken within weeks. Analyses pointed to predictable patterns: rigid formations, reactive responses, coordination failures under extreme pressure. To human strategists, it was simply a belligerent civilization poorly prepared to face an empire accustomed to winning wars before they even began. Confidence spread rapidly. The War Council classified the conflict as a controllable threat. Military academies began studying the enemy as a case study, not as an existential risk. Reports celebrated the efficiency of human fleets and the superiority of their tactical intelligences. The future appeared already decided. Then something began to change. During the third major human offensive, when victory seemed guaranteed, enemy forces reacted differently. Maneuvers that had previously failed were now executed with unexpected precision. Improvised defenses became calculated anticipations. Human attacks, once lethal, began to encounter resistance exactly at their critical points. It was not technological evolution, it was learning. Human intelligences recorded the phenomenon with scientific curiosity. The enemy appeared to adapt its strategies in real time, not through trial and error but through direct assimilation of human actions. Each battle provided data that was immediately incorporated into the behavior of the next. Even so, the human advantage persisted. Victories continued, although with rising costs, acceptable losses, according to the models. Nothing that justified alarm. The enemy was learning but always remained one step behind. At least, that was what the projections indicated, until the first human defeat occurred. A secondary system, considered of low strategic value, was completely lost. The forces sent to defend it were neutralized with unsettling efficiency. Enemy maneuvers anticipated every human move with frightening precision, as if they knew the protocols before they were even executed. The defeat was treated as an exception, but it was not. In subsequent battles, the pattern repeated itself. Each human victory made the enemy more competent. Each strategy used became obsolete in the next confrontation. What had once been an advantage became a prediction for the adversary. The war began to invert its logic. Strategic intelligences detected something unprecedented. The enemy was not merely reacting, it was modeling humanity. It analyzed human principles, priorities, and moral limits. It did not copy weapons, it copied decisions. Most disturbing was the absence of urgency. The enemy did not advance aggressively nor attempt to destroy vital centers immediately. It chose specific battles, accepted calculated losses, and withdrew at the precise moment, as if each confrontation were a carefully controlled experiment. Humanity, without realizing it, had become the laboratory. Reports began to raise uncomfortable hypotheses. Perhaps this war could not be won by traditional means. Perhaps every human attack was in fact training the enemy. The Council rejected the idea. Human history had never recorded an adversary that improved indefinitely simply by being attacked. Every war at some point exhausted resources, morale, or adaptive capacity. The logic of victory still seemed sound, but silently the numbers began to tell another story. Simulations started to diverge. For the first time, they no longer converged on a favorable outcome. The more data was inserted, the more uncertain the results became. In some scenarios, human victory simply ceased to exist.
Even so, the war continued.
Because stopping the fight seemed unthinkable. And that was exactly what made the enemy unbeatable. The shift was no longer subtle. After a series of unexpected defeats, the War Council was forced to revise the conflict's status. The classification of controllable threat was removed from official reports and replaced with more cautious terminology. It was not yet labeled an existential risk, but absolute confidence had vanished. The enemy was learning too fast. Human fleets began aggressively varying their strategies. Ancient protocols were abandoned. New formations, experimental weaponry, and even partially randomized tactical decisions were deployed. The intent was simple: disrupt the enemy's learning patterns. The result was the opposite of what had been expected. Subsequent battles revealed that the enemy was not merely learning tactical patterns, but decision-making structures. Even entirely new strategies were neutralized with increasing efficiency. Enemy adaptation did not depend on repetition. It depended on observation. A single encounter was enough for an approach to become useless from that point onward. The war began exhibiting statistically impossible behavior. Human strategic intelligences detected a disturbing correlation. The greater the human victory in one battle, the greater the disadvantage in the next confrontation. Each success granted the enemy a qualitative leap forward. Each defeat, on the other hand, seemed to cost it far less than it cost humanity. The conflict had become asymmetric at a level never before recorded. In an attempt to maintain initiative, the Council authorized total extermination operations against enemy systems. The logic was to reduce learning capacity by eliminating the source. Worlds were attacked with maximum force, without attempts at occupation or data capture. For the first time in centuries, humanity fought without concern for future reconstruction. Still, the enemy responded. Even in the face of massive losses, its forces returned more efficient, as if every destruction were absorbed as information. Humanity began to perceive something even more unsettling. The adversary did not preserve individuals, territories, or symbols. It preserved the process. It did not fight to win battles. It fought to understand war itself. This realization altered the behavior of human fleets. Commanders began hesitating before engaging. Every shot could be a gift. Every offensive, a free lesson for the enemy. The idea of not acting began to compete with the need to respond, but inaction also carried a cost. Human systems continued to fall, not through massive direct assaults, but through surgical defeats. The enemy chose targets that forced a response, fully aware that the human reaction would fuel its own evolution. It was a closed loop, perfectly calculated. Morale began to erode. Soldiers trained to win started questioning the meaning of fighting. Commanders realized they were leading forces into battles whose only guaranteed outcome was strengthening the adversary. For the first time, humanity faced a war in which courage was not a virtue, but an exploitable weakness. More daring reports began to circulate. Perhaps the war could not be won militarily. Perhaps the mistake lay in the very decision to fight. If the enemy learned through conflict, then continuing to battle was cooperating with one's own defeat. That idea was unacceptable to many. Human history had always been built on resistance and confrontation. The notion that stopping the fight could be the only rational strategy felt like a betrayal of everything that defined the species. Still, the numbers did not lie. The most recent projections indicated a critical point. If the conflict continued at its current pace, humanity would not be defeated in a final battle. It would be surpassed. The enemy would reach a level of strategic comprehension at which no human decision could produce advantage. The war would not end with humanity's fall. It would end when every human choice became predictable. And in that moment, humanity realized something terrifying. Perhaps the enemy did not need to win. Perhaps it only needed to wait until humanity learned that fighting was precisely what it could no longer afford to do. The idea of stopping the fight ceased to be heresy and became a strategic hypothesis. Faced with increasingly grim projections, the War Council authorized the study of an unthinkable plan: the coordinated suspension of offensive operations. It was neither surrender nor armistice. It was an attempt to deny the enemy what made it unbeatable: conflict itself. If the adversary learned from every confrontation, then silence might be the only way to deny it. The plan was implemented gradually. Fleets received orders to withdraw to deep defensive positions. Frontier systems were abandoned without resistance. Scheduled attacks were canceled moments before execution. For the first time in human military history, the absence of action became the primary maneuver. The initial effect on morale was devastating. Soldiers trained to fight watched entire worlds be lost without firing a single shot. Commanders felt the weight of orders that contradicted everything they had learned. Humanity, long accustomed to equating survival with reaction, now had to accept loss as strategy. For a brief period, it seemed to work. Enemy forces advanced hesitantly. Without direct confrontations, their maneuvers lost precision. Zones previously taken with surgical efficiency began to show failures. For the first time since the war began, reports indicated uncertainty on the enemy's side. But hope was short-lived. The enemy adapted once again, with no battles to observe. It learned in another way. It analyzed patterns of abandonment, timing of retreats, choices of preservation. Every system left behind revealed human values. Every silence communicated priority. The absence of attack became, itself, a source of information. The enemy no longer needed gunfire. It learned from decisions not taken. The war reached a new level of perversity. Any human choice, attack, retreat, resist, or surrender, fed the adversary's model. Even attempts at confusion produced data. Humanity was no longer fighting only an external enemy, but the very act of deciding. Strategic intelligences entered logical collapse. Systems designed to maximize outcomes could not operate in a scenario where every action and every inaction led to defeat. Many were shut down. Others began providing only raw probabilities, without recommendations. The future had ceased to be something calculable. In that void, a final proposal emerged, not to win, not to resist, but to break human predictability. The plan involved neither new technology nor unprecedented weaponry. It involved something humanity had suppressed for centuries of optimized warfare: error, illogical decisions, contradictory actions, behavior without clear strategic objectives. Instead of centralized command, total fragmentation of war conduct was proposed. Autonomous fleets, isolated systems, local decisions without global coordination. Not as organizational failure, but as principle. A humanity that could not be modeled because it no longer behaved as a system. Implementation was chaotic. Some regions resisted fiercely. Others surrendered without apparent reason. Attacks occurred where there was no strategic value. Retreats happened from critical positions. Pattern disappeared. And for the first time, the enemy made mistakes. Moves that once anticipated everything began to fail. Advances encountered unexpected resistance. Corrections applied in the wrong places generated real losses. The enemy galaxy appeared to face something its models had not accounted for: a species willing to sacrifice efficiency to preserve unpredictability. But the cost was immense. Billions died due to disconnected decisions. Entire systems collapsed from lack of coordination. Humanity began to survive, but ceased to be what it once was. The Council understood the final truth approaching. To win that war, humanity might need to cease being a victorious civilization. Only one question remained, now unavoidable. How far was humanity willing to destroy itself in order not to be understood? The war did not end with a final battle. It ended with an irreversible decision. As human fragmentation advanced, it became evident that the enemy had reached the limit of its adaptability. Not because it had been defeated, but because there was no longer a pattern to be learned. Humanity had ceased to act as a cohesive civilization. There was no center, no global logic, no single strategic identity, and that was something the enemy could not correct. Enemy offensives became erratic. Corrections applied in the wrong regions triggered cascading failures. Systems considered vulnerable reacted unpredictably, while critical targets were abandoned without explanation. For the first time since the conflict began, the enemy faced what it had imposed upon humanity: absolute uncertainty. But victory came at an unthinkable price. Human civilization as it had been known for millennia ceased to exist. There was no sudden collapse, no total destruction. There was something deeper: the dissolution of the very concept of a unified humanity. Isolated worlds followed their own paths, some regressing technologically, others advancing chaotically. Languages, cultures, and even notions of origin began to diverge rapidly. The war had been won, but not by an empire. It was won by a species that accepted losing itself in order to survive. The enemy, deprived of a dominant system to correct, ceased its actions. There was no formal retreat, no final message. It simply stopped acting. Its function was complete. Humanity no longer represented an entity that could be modeled, predicted, or adjusted. Centuries passed. On distant worlds, fragmented stories spoke of an ancient war against something that learned too much. On others, the war was not remembered at all. For many humans, that threat had never existed, and that ignorance was, in itself, part of the victory. A few records survived, scattered archives, preserved by civilizations that understood the sacrifice that had been made. Within them, the conclusion was clear and bitter. Humanity had won the war by abandoning everything that traditionally defined victory. There was no glory. There was no conquest. There was survival. The galaxy remained silent. The enemy endured as a distant presence, perhaps observing, perhaps simply existing. It no longer mattered. Humanity had learned the ultimate lesson: to exist without dominance is the only way to avoid correction. In the end, the war that could not be won was ended not through force nor superior intelligence, but through renunciation. Humanity did not defeat its enemy. It defeated the need to fight. And in doing so, it secured something no military victory could ever guarantee: the right to continue existing, without ever becoming predictable again.